One of the more famous passages in the gospel that corresponds to the beginning of Advent is found in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 13, where the Lord invites us to stay awake. Now, maybe it's just me, but I think a lot of times when people hear that particular passage, they interpret it as an invitation to just live in tension, to white knuckle it until the Lord comes again to judge the living and the dead. Which begs the question, is that really how we're supposed to think? Is that really how we're supposed to act during the season of Advent to, again, prepare for the coming of the Messiah? I would suggest perhaps not. So in order to explain what the gospel actually means when it talks about staying awake, perhaps you might begin by talking about the opposite concept, this notion of sleep. What does the Bible actually mean when it talks about sleep? Well, certainly in our kind of modern day context, we tend to think of sleep strictly as a physical thing, a bodily thing. But in contrast, obviously the Bible is highlighting the spiritual notion of sleep, which is basically to say this. From the classical perspective, spiritual sleep obtains when the soul stops doing what it's supposed to do. In other words, when it stops processing, combining, collating various forms of input from out there, but also from within. So whether we're talking about sensory information out there in the world, or even things like our memories or our imagination. And the whole idea is that when a soul stops doing this particular primary function, then basically there's a failure to achieve a deeper understanding as to what's actually happening out there in the world, as a result of which one's ability to choose and live appropriately is very much compromised. You see, once we have clarity about this classical notion of spiritual sleep, perhaps it might help us understand the biblical notion of what it means to stay awake. And so basically the whole idea here is that I don't allow myself to be pulled in a million different directions by the various things out there or even things within my heart. But instead I have this clear sense of purpose and direction based on this threefold paradigm which is typically associated with spiritual discernment, namely see, judge, and act. And so again, seeing, being aware of my experience, whether we're talking about stuff out there or things, again, going on within my own heart. Judging, deciding whether or not these certain invitations to do this or that is from the evil spirit or the good spirit. And then finally, acting, choosing appropriately in a sense of firmly rejecting that which is from the evil spirit and warmly embracing and savoring that which is from the good shepherd, otherwise known as the good spirit. To further illustrate this particular point, I want to spend some time right now expounding upon one of St. Paul's most famous letters, his letter to the Philippians, specifically chapter 4, verse 6 to 9, which perhaps surprisingly provides really specific instructions as to how to implement this principle of see, judge, and act. So first, what the Lord speaking through St. Paul basically invites us to not worry. And so just to kind of paraphrase what he says is don't worry, but instead through prayer and thanksgiving, make all your requests known to the Lord. And then the peace of Christ, which is beyond all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds. And if you think about it, this particular part of the passage from St. Paul basically calls us out for trying to rationalize our stress. And so what typically happens is that we go about our lives, which of course are busy and filled with all sorts of things and stuff. And again, we rationalize our stress. We rationalize our worry. We rationalize our fear. Telling ourselves, well, look, the reason why I'm so stressed out, the reason why I'm so worried and afraid is because, yeah, I'm busy. And so I have no choice but to give in to these things because this is the state of my life. Whereas in contrast, the thing we're supposed to do is to situate everything in God's call. To recurringly and habitually ask ourselves the question, is God calling me to sustain this particular train of thought or this particular mode of being? And oftentimes the answer comes to us pretty quickly, especially in times when we're inclined to feel kind of overwhelmed by our lives. And so the simple way to put it is that God never calls you to be worried, to be afraid, to give in to fear. And so you might go through all sorts of challenging circumstances and various emotions might arise in the midst of these same circumstances. But again, the point still remains that God never calls you to give into any of these negative feelings which tend to kind of weigh you down in the midst of these difficult and challenging circumstances. But instead, he always invites you to enter into the dynamic of the multiplication of the loaves and the fish, to remind ourselves that we're never called to feed the 5,000 people, but instead we're always called to provide simply the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. To focus on the few things the Lord wants us to do carefully and well right now in the present moment, and again to entrust everything else to the Lord with prayer and thanksgiving, and thereby receive the peace of Christ which is beyond all understanding. Okay, now that said, another key bit of advice that St. Paul gives in this particular chapter from the letter to the Philippians is basically to say this: keep on doing what you have learned from me, what you have received in me, what you have heard and seen in me. Now, obviously, it's a really short and pithy bit of advice, but basically the whole idea is that even though we're all imperfect, and even though we're all kind of pilgrims on the journey of becoming the persons that God has called us to be, at the same time, during the season of Advent, it's a really good time for us to kind of ask the question, what are some obvious and major things that I'm doing or not doing, which are basically pulling me away from being in right relationship with God? And so maybe I have certain kind of weighty sins that I have in my conscience that need to be confessed, or which demand a certain sense of reconciliation and atonement with regards to my neighbor. Or maybe it's simply a matter of working to my life finally certain good habits that I've always been aware of, but I've never actually kind of brought into the context of my life. Whether we're talking about, for example, going to Mass or going to confession on a regular basis, or simply beginning a habit of prayer, which is every day as opposed to occasionally when I'm in need or I'm facing a particular problem or issue. In any case, the third point that St. Paul actually makes in the context of this letter to the Philippians basically goes like this. Whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, think about these things. And so basically, it's a really poetic way to articulate this principle of no in favor of a greater yes. And so again, no to worry, no to anxiety, no to fear, but yes to what? Again, yes to that which is true and honorable and just and pure. In other words, instead of living in tension, but also instead of simply kind of guarding your heart against negative fears and concerns and all those things, make it a point to populate your heart and your mind with all the different ways the Lord is blessing you, all the different ways He's bestowing upon you grace and goodness through the world and through the people of God. Because if you take the time and acquire the discipline to saturate your hearts and your minds with all these good things, all these different ways, again, that the Lord is blessing you abundantly, not only will you have no time to sin, but instead your heart will be filled with joy and peace, because again, you'll be fully aware of the imminent presence of the Lord our God. Okay, one final example, and I'll kind of end with this. And so recently I came across the story of the martyrdom of St. John Fisher, this bishop who was executed in the 16th century. And so basically the story goes, he was in prison when all of a sudden this prison guard came to him at 5 o'clock in the morning and told him that he'd be executed at noon that same day. In response to which St. John Fisher apparently said to the guard, okay, fine, but I'm a little tired, so wake me up in a couple hours. And I love that story because it really helps to bring together all these things we've been talking about today, and in particular highlight this notion of what it means to enter into the season of Advent. So yes, we're called to stay awake, we're called to not fall asleep. But again, that doesn't mean that we're called to live constantly in tension or to white knuckle it. But instead, it means we're called to enter into the peace of Christ, the peace of Christ which is beyond all understanding. And how do we do that? Again, by not worrying, by giving all our cares and concerns to God the Father, by making sure we're doing certain obvious things to bring us back into right relationship with God, and filling our hearts and minds with all the different ways the Lord is blessing us and gracing us and loving us. As we keep these different principles in mind as we begin this season of Advent, that's a really good way to prepare for the coming of the Messiah. And may God bless you all.